go. Okay, so just a quick introduction on Susan Moyers. Dr. Moyers is a regulatory professional. She has over 20 years of experience in developing, training, and auditing food facilities, as well as pharmaceutical and dietary supplement management systems. She consults with EAS clients to develop programs and implement the BRC and FQS standards. And over the years, she's audited several hundred manufacturing plants for FDA and EU compliance for food, dietary supplements, and pharmaceutical regulations. She's a native of Philadelphia, and her undergraduate degree is from Penn State. She has a PhD in food science and nutrition from the University of Florida and a master's of public health from the University of South Florida, and she currently resides in Tampa. She's been with EAS, gosh, Susan, since I don't even remember how long, 2015? Is it that long?
2013, maybe.
2013? Okay, so she's been with the EAS a long time and has done numerous programs for us since coming on board, as well as, of course, helping clients directly. So I will turn it over to Susan and mute my microphone. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This is Susan. I won't be able to show you my video, but at least you can see my picture during this part of the beginning of the seminar. Just a little bit more on the logistics. If you do have a question at any time during the presentation, if you could please type it into the chat box. And during the break, we're going to take at least one break. And during the break, I'll review those questions and I will answer them after the break. And then if there are any lingering questions or comments, we can take care of that at the end of the webinar. So now let's just get started in our webinar about internal auditing keys to success. We're going to look at several aspects of internal auditing. First of all, the kinds of internal audits you can do, whether your internal audit will be credible or not credible. It's a good question for a lot of audits that you might see. How you're going to structure and schedule the audit. Are you going to use forms, software, the kind of decision process you have to go through in order to make that determination, actually conducting the audit, and then most importantly, the audit follow-up. Once you've put in your findings and you've written your non-conformances, what next? How do you follow up? So that's basically a review of our topics. We're going to start out with a definition from the Institute of Internal Audits in the UK. We don't have one here, but in the UK, they describe what they believe to be the internal audit purpose. And that is covering issues that are fundamentally important to the survival and profitability of the business. They take the pulse of systems and processes to keep the company on track, and they provide fodder for change and data to improve systems. So basically, you're taking the pulse of the system and you're looking for things that go wrong. And then in your corrective action and your other planning, you're looking for how to change those things to being right or to be improved. And that's what an internal audit is about. And to go for some more definitions, I'd like to go back to the group I consider the granddaddy of all standards organizations, and that's ISO, the International Standards Institute. As you may know, ISO started many decades ago in the automotive and aerospace and other related industry, and now recently in past decades has moved into food and medical devices and OTC drugs and various other kinds of disciplines. But they have in their definition, I think, 4 adjectives that I consider to be very important in describing an audit. First of all, the audit is systematic, independent, documented, and objective. Look for those 4 adjectives in that definition. Systematic means it's organized. Whatever you're going to audit, there's a plan, there's an organized factor to it. It's independent. And this is something we'll be talking about a lot during the next minutes, because it's important what they call cross-functional auditing or independent auditing. That is, people are not auditing their own departments. You have an independent eye, independent set of eyes looking at a process, product, or other item that you're going to be auditing. And documented. You have to have reports and other documentation to show that the audit was done and that it was effective. And then again, the evidence has to be objective. So avoiding bias at all costs. Sometimes that can be difficult. And we have a section about that coming up a little bit later on this afternoon. But this is the definition from ISO. And for those of you who are interested in formal audit training by ISO, you can look at that book, ISO 19011 2018. That is their Bible or guideline for how to conduct any type of audit of a management system. And we'll talk about that book a little bit more later too. So if you are a facility that is certified in ISO, and that would include the food protocols for FSSC 22000, you can look at some of their clauses in ISO 9001, which is the current version of the ISO protocol. You know, the organization should conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the quality management system conforms to the organization's own requirement, the ISO requirements, and also that the system is effectively implemented and maintained. The second clause they have, the organization must plan, establish, implement, and maintain the program. So you have to have a schedule, a timetable to include frequency, how often you're going to do it, the methods, how you're going to do it, the responsibility, who is going to do it, planning and reporting, who's going to look at the report, who's going to do the report. And again, we'll go into all those areas a little more deeply as we move along here. So those of you in the food industry are probably familiar with SQF, or Safe Quality Food. And as you may know, under the SQF version 9, which is the newest version, you're going to have to do an internal audit of the SQF system. That is, everything that is in their standard has to be reviewed and audited internally at least annually. Now, a lot of people break that up in their organization. The SQF system is pretty complex. So they might do, for example, environmental monitoring in January and complaint management in February, et cetera, so that by the time the year is done, a complete audit of the SQF system is done. In the OTC drug world and dietary supplement world, you don't have a regulatory requirement. The standards that we see, the most relevant standards, are with the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI 455, which is a newer document. And they're pretty liberal in terms of how they describe an internal audit. They just say they're conducted periodically. Doesn't have to be once a year, once a month, once a quarter. It's periodically. And you have to maintain your corrective action file. So that's for OTC. For dietary supplements, it's similar. It does not require any specific interval or specific requirements, only that QC personnel shall be involved and they shall have responsibilities in the audit. So depending upon what protocol you subscribe to, what standard you subscribe to, what industry you're in, requirements for internal audits can vary. One last one is for the BRC, which is the British Retail Consortium. This is a food standard. It also applies to other industries. And what they require is a more prescriptive program. You have to do an internal audit at least 4 times a year. So that is the most rigid requirement that I've seen on the protocols. Once every quarter for this audit. But you have to also include all the elements of that BRC standard in your audit. Another thing that the BRC mentions is something that has come up a little bit more recently, and that is the question of risk, a risk-based audit. The third bullet point there says, audit shall be established in relation to the risk associated with the activity and the prior performance. So what the BRC asks auditors to do is to look at items that would be of more risk to the business, to the quality, or to the safety, and focus on those more heavily than other aspects of the BRC system. So Lots of ways to look at internal audits in terms of how you're going to conduct them or what you're going to do. Just about every establishment that I've audited has some form or another of a GMP audit, where you're looking at buildings, grounds, uniforms, locker rooms, hygiene, all of those areas. Sometimes it's a good checklist, sometimes it's a not so good checklist. So we'll talk more about that too. There are specific programs. You can do an internal audit on specific programs. For example, if your facility is experiencing a lot of complaints, especially repeated complaints, you may want to go take a deeper dive and do complaint management internal audit. Trace and recall. Again, just about everybody does some sort of trace and recall, traceability study, and that can be looked at as one form of an internal audit, where you're looking at the ingredients in your product and where they came from, and your finished product and where it shipped out to. So you can trace the incoming and trace the outgoing. That's a subject for an internal audit of a specific type. Then, of course, there's your compliance audits for ISO, SQF, or even regulatory compliance, such as an FDA audit, for example. And then finally, this idea of risk-based. This concept is relatively new. And basically what it's trying to say is that if there is something that is of particular risk to your business, be it safety, quality, or customer acceptance, then that might deserve its own internal audit. Let me give you an example. Let's say you've got one big customer that's responsible for 40% of your business. And that customer has not been real happy because of one or two things that may have happened. So you may want to do a deep dive, a complete internal audit into that customer's product or products, that customer's processes from beginning to end. So that's a risk-based audit, because if you lose that customer, of course, your business is at risk. So again, the risk-based concept is one that's coming into more and more use when we look at audits in general, but internal audits in particular. Two of my favorite phrases when I look at audits and internal audits are: one size does not fit all, and there is no solution where you just add water. So what am I trying to say there? If you have experience as an auditor, internal auditor or external, and you walk into a new facility or you transfer from one facility to the next, you may have a tendency to say, oh, this audit checklist worked for company A, let me try it again for company B. And it may not be the case. So every time you approach an internal audit, it's suggested that you look at the facility itself, because there are no two facilities that are exactly alike. There are no two internal audits that are exactly alike. So you can't just transfer. You can look at the audits you've done before and try to tweak them to meet the new facility needs. But to use checklists from facility to facility often doesn't work. The just add water solutions is where you purchase a checklist or you purchase some software, and the vendor of that product tells you, oh, all you need is this, and you can do a complete audit of your facility. Not so. There are some really good templates out there, but anytime you're working with a template, you have to look at what your needs are versus what's on the template. And so you just can't add water, or you just can't copy and paste to create an internal audit for a facility based on some product that you're buying from a vendor. One thing you can look at, though, is the past audits, especially what kind of non-conformances were found. What has been the weakness in the facility in the past? You know, are there repeat non-conformances of the same nature? And also, you know, every time there's an audit, there's usually some sort of corrective action. But sometimes as an auditor, and I look at corrective action, I find that there's really not a lot of follow-up to see whether it was effective. You fixed something, But do you go back and look at whether that fix actually worked or whether something else is needed? So when you're setting up an internal audit, again, past audits and past corrective actions can be an effective window into what you need to do in the future. Another thing to remember is that an audit is a snapshot. It is not a permanent fixture. You're sampling the process. And that doesn't mean that everything that you see is true all the time. So as an example of this, I like to say, you know, I've been in audits where I found, for example, someone is not recording the times for weight checks on the packaging line, and I will write it up. And the manager will say to me, well, this was just an off event. He always does this. This was just an unusual event. Well, okay, it was an unusual event. That's all well and good. But it happened. So when you find something like that, you should write it up because it could be an index into what else might be happening in that particular scenario. So, you know, it's a snapshot. It doesn't mean that everybody's wrong, that the guy is wrong who was supposed to do the checks. It doesn't mean that everybody was right. It just means it was something that was observed as a snapshot in time and it was recorded. Hope that makes sense. And then an internal audit, again, we've talked a little bit about this in a couple of prior slides. What you do versus what you said you were going to do. What goes right and what doesn't go right. What do you need to change, if anything? So really you're looking at a tool for continuous improvement rather than a tool that traps people or looks at problems. You really want to look to the future and to continuous improvement. Another good thing about internal audits is it does give an opportunity to cross-train staff. What do I mean by that? Well, most internal audits like to be set up or should be set up in a team, not just one person doing the audit. And so if you choose people who are in one department and choose them to audit another department in a cross-functional audit, that gives you the opportunity to cross-train people and increase skill sets for lots of people on the staff. So that contributes overall to the well-being of the business. So I'd like to do a poll now. I think Amy's out there to help us with a poll. If you could let us know whether you have an audit, an internal audit, and what type it is, if it's an ISO audit, an SQF, a BRC audit, another type of standard, or if you don't have an audit. So we'll try to take a look at those answers. I'm not sure how Amy's going to handle that. Let me take down my screen. Oh, let's see. Don't see anything out there in the answer area. I think I have to stop sharing my screen in order to see it. Yes. Okay. No, it's not showing me anything. Sorry about that. So we'll have to go back into my sharing my screen. Okay. Sorry about that. Again, you see my little microphone there. I have a technological challenge here. I can't figure out how to get rid of that. So I hope you can bear with me as I have that on the screen. Amy, if you're there and you can help me out, I appreciate it. So looking at the types of audits. If you review any of the literature, any of the writings about internal audits, they usually use these terms: first party, second party, and third party audit. Just to clarify, if you're not familiar with that designation, an internal audit is a first party. That is you auditing yourself. you auditing your facility. A second party audit is an audit of a stakeholder. Typically, that would be a customer audit or someone who has a stake in the business. And a third party audit is an independent certification body, regulatory body, or someone with no interest, no stake in the business. So that, to clarify that. And then again, you can audit various aspects of your operations product. You can do a product only. Again, that would be something you might want to do if you have a major customer that you want to make sure you're doing right by. You'd audit for his or her product. You can audit a process. I want to audit my packaging line. I want to audit my receiving line. Those, you can audit an entire system. I want to audit the internet system. I want to audit the web system. Or you can do compliance audits for FDA. Just some categories. And I seem to have lost control of the screen. Let's see. Try this again. Oh, I got the chat. Someone can't see my screen. I'm going to try it again. That's better for the person who could not see the screen. I see one thing in the chat room here. We can see it now. Okay, thanks very much for letting me know. Okay. The audit criteria. Whenever you set up an internal audit, it's important for you to have a sit down and look at exactly what you're trying to find out. Are you going to audit against standards, such as the SQF standards? Are you going to audit against a customer, in which case you want to be sure about what's in the contract with that customer? Are you going to audit to specifications, that is packaging specifications or product specifications or vendor specifications? What are you going to audit? Policies? Are you going to audit? Well, there was a reason not too long ago to audit the COVID policy of the facility to make sure that everybody did what they were supposed to do in terms of getting any testing or any temperature checks and all of that. You might want to audit against policies or regulations. The reason to talk about that is that you may want to do 2 or 3 or more types of internal audits, and might involve different folks all of the time. So we'll take a look at some of that information a little bit later. Okay, I'm still sharing my screen. There we go. Who participates in the internal audit? A team is recommended, highly recommended. No person is an island. No one pair of eyes can see more than multiple pairs of eyes. And so ISO and the other facilities, the other standards that promote internal audits usually state a team and a cross-functional team. Regardless of the team, there should be a lead. Somebody who has been trained in how to audit, has hopefully some experience in auditing, and that person is the lead. And then you might have team auditors, some people who work with the lead. And that may or may not, but it may include line staff. That is, people who are working in a non-supervisory position. They sometimes know more than some of the supervisors if you look at some of the detail that's required in operations. So line supervisors or line people are often suggested. And again, as we mentioned earlier, when you do that, you get an opportunity to cross-train your staff, so you have expanding of the skill sets. There are times when you might need a subject matter expert to assist. Like, for example, if you're doing a computer systems audit, you may need somebody with expertise in that area to take a look at what's going on with your web or your internal documents. Or let's say you might have an aseptic packing line. You might need somebody with expertise in that aseptic equipment to help you determine what questions there are and what the right answers should be. And then, of course, auditor training. No matter what level the auditor, a lead auditor or a team auditor, there should be some training in the work that they're about to do. Will your audit be believable? Will it be credible? Well, the credibility depends on a lot of things. First of all, are the auditors qualified? Do they have some training? Do they know what they're looking for? Are they independent? You don't want people auditing their own department. And I've seen that, not a lot these days, but people looking and auditing their own group of individuals. And of course, no one likes to tell on themselves. So independence is not always achieved in those circumstances. And again, the concept of cross-functional. People working in one area would be auditing people or processes in another area. Probably the most important thing in any audit, really in any undertaking, is to have the support of management. If the audit team is going to go out and do an audit and has some findings that they share with management, management doesn't want to do anything about those findings, then, what good is your audit? You need to have supportive management with the team, and that what the team finds will be supported. The objectivity of the team, again, the lack of bias. And there are ways that you can do that in the way you approach, interview, and the way you write up your non-conformances and your other comments. And that we'll do later on in the second part of this webinar. And then indemnification of the audit team. What does that mean? It means nobody's going to be mad at you if you write them up. The audit team is not there to audit people. It's there to audit processes and to see what improvements can be made or should be made, or whether the process is working as it should work. So there should not be indemnification. There should not be any blaming of the audit team for finding things. They find what they find, and that should be accepted. And if you don't have a good, clear audit that is accepted by management and that is accepted by the staff that's being audited, then you have doubts about the credibility. I hope that makes sense for you all. Again, a conflict of interest can occur if someone is auditing their own department, or maybe even auditing a friend's department. If management doesn't support an internal audit, and it's being done just to show that you've done it for the SQF standard or for whatever standard you're achieving, you can be careless and negligent and just put check marks for everything. And so it can just be a paper exercise that doesn't mean anything. And that would be a non-credible audit. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section, but I can see a Q&A here, so I'm going to see if I can pull that up. The Quality Assurance Department is in charge of the internal audit program. How can they audit the QA inspectors in the plant if they are part of the same department? Absolutely, a great question. So who should audit QA? QA is auditing the other departments, and that's nice because that's an independent activity from the production and packaging and other groups. But who audits QA? That's a business decision, and that's something you might want to look at in terms of talking with management. Could production audit QA? Could a regulatory department audit QA? How should that go? Is it beneficial to be an ASQ certified auditor is another question. It's always beneficial to have formal audit training. There are audit courses that are given around the world. Most of them are in person, but some are online, 2-3-day courses, some 5-day courses in some of the audit protocols. If you can have that training, that's great. Is it necessary? I don't think so, to have that certification. I think it's necessary to have training for the lead auditor especially, and then the team auditors can have training in the specific disciplines that they are auditing. But the lead auditor certainly should have audit training of a more formal nature. I hope that answers your question. If not, we can move on and get to that topic a little bit later. Okay, so now I'm going to look at resources. In terms of resources, I said this earlier, I'll say it again, probably will say it a few more times as we move along. The unequivocal support of senior management is absolutely necessary for a successful internal audit. If you find something in the audit that's important to follow on, you want to make sure you've got the support of senior management. Let's say you're doing an audit and you find that there's a problem with plumbing. You got to put in a new sink or a new this or a new that. That's going to cost a lot of money. So you have to make sure that your findings, your recommendations have the support of management, that if that's truly necessary, that management is going to follow through and put in that new sink or do whatever needs to be done. If for example, additional staff is needed. If it's found that there is a weakness in an area because there aren't enough people, you have to have the support of senior management to follow up on your findings. And that's the absolute most important thing. And they say this in SQF, they say this in most other protocols. If you don't have senior management support, you're almost wasting your time. So that's the critical factor. Then you want to build an audit team. Who is responsible for selecting a lead auditor? Do you have more than one lead auditor in your environment, or one qualified lead auditor in your environment? Who determines the size of the audit team? How many people do you need in the audit team? These are all decisions that are very specific to your facility. In some cases, a smaller facility, maybe 2 or 3 people is fine. In a larger facility, you may want to have many teams, each doing a different facility aspect or product or process. Training, again, audit team members should be trained or should know enough about the facility and about the process they're auditing to be able to make evaluations, and then cross-functional. Is of course recommended. Do you need software? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on your physical constraints. It may be better to walk around with an iPad than with a piece of paper and a checklist, in certain environments. You may have a large facility with lots of aspects where the software program really is beneficial. But again, these are business decisions. There are lots of good products out there. There are some not so good products out there. But as you decide how your internal audit is going to move forward, the software decision is something that should be considered. How often are you going to audit? If you're a BRC certified facility, you got that written out for you. You got to do it 4 times a year, at least. But if you're in a GFSI environment, or if you're in the OTC drug or dietary supplement business, what frequency are you going to use? And, how are you going to look at risk? Are you going to look at things that have happened in the past and zoom in on those? What type of issues are important? Maybe I need to audit the complaint management system a couple times this year because I've had a lot of complaints. I've had a lot of recurring issues, would be a question. Or maybe I need to monitor the pest control program because we've had a lot of pest control issues. Maybe I need to do that more frequently than I do some of the other things. Again, these are all facility-specific decisions, and the reason I'm talking about them is to give you something to think about as you put together your internal audit program. Whether your system or process is new or mature is another question. If you have a new product, for example, or a new piece of equipment, that may be something you want to look at a little more closely than you would some of your mature, older products and systems which have been functioning well. So, and then of course, if you have non-conformances from FDA or from SQF or BRC or another certification body, then of course you want to look at that in terms of covering that in your internal audit. Again, one size does not fit all, and one audit doesn't fit every situation. Here are some examples of what you might use as a scope statement. Again, what is the scope of your audit? One, an audit of the process for product ABC to ensure all customer requirements are met. So you're going to audit the process, which might mean from the arrival of the raw materials through disbursement and shipment of materials for the product that ABC buys from you or has you make if you're a co-manufacturer. So that might be one type of audit, and that would be a customer-oriented audit, maybe a risk-based audit. And then a third example, a second example rather, is you're going to audit procedures and records. This would be a desk audit. You're going to review the records to see that the QMS system is working as intended. So in that case, you're going to confine yourself to computer work, paperwork, and documents. So again, a scope statement for your audit is a good idea. Do you have specific requirements that you have to meet? Is there a specific regulatory benchmark? For example, if you're in the food industry, if you're in the cooking business, usually 165 is the temperature that's considered to be an effective kill step for a lot of foods. If that's a published requirement. If it is a contract requirement, one example might be if your customer contract requires that you put their SKU number on every case label. Is that a specific requirement in a customer audit that you would want to audit against? And I've seen that, where there are customers out there that want their internal SKU and maybe an expiration date on the case labels. Do you do that? Can you audit that? Is there an established and accurate audit checklist? You may have an audit checklist, as I said, there may be one that a vendor provides or that you have from another facility, but is it accurate for your facility itself? And we'll talk again a little bit later about that too. So how do you put your internal audit team together? This can be a little bit tricky. Your auditor is maybe going to have to call out non-conformances. They're going to have to tell people about errors, omissions, and mistakes. So when you look at who's going to do that, you want to look at the personalities and the interpersonal skills of the people who are going to do that. It might not be a good idea to have somebody who's a very confrontational person in that position. Again, these are all judgments that you have to make in terms of picking your audit team on who would be the best to present and to handle an internal audit. Problem-solving skills, again, understanding the facility and being able to identify issues and problems. Close attention to detail. And detail is quite important in an audit of any kind, especially in a document audit. If you're trying to review the checklist for checking the metal detector or checking the weight of a product or doing any kind of pre-op, you have to look at paperwork and look to see that everything is dated, signed, initialed, et cetera, et cetera. So somebody who's going to do an audit, a document audit, really needs to be very attentive to detail in paperwork. And ability to work independently and in a group. How you conduct the internal audit is up to you. You may want one individual going to this part of the line, another individual going to that part of the line, or you may want everybody to go together. That's another decision you would make as you're putting together your audit procedure. Again, interpersonal skills and finding the right people, that is a very important and can be a very delicate decision to pick the right people to do the audit. Conflict resolution skills. I've been on a number of audits, more than I care to say, where I call out something and I get, sometimes outright hostility. We don't do that. We haven't done that. That's not wrong. You might have heard that if you're an internal auditor yourself or an external auditor. You have to be able to have somebody who can deal with that kind of reaction and any kind of conflict that may come up when you do call out a non-conformance. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody wants to do that. So, those are important things to consider as you put together your audit team. And it also is important to communicate that auditors are not policemen or policewomen. Auditors are there to audit a system, a process, a document. They're not there to audit people. We're not trying to target people. We're trying to target the system. So if someone makes a mistake in the system, that's not necessarily their fault. It might be the system's fault. And that's something to take a look at. You're not the police and you're not auditing people. So anybody who has that approach is probably not the best internal auditor. So when you talk to people, there are different kinds of interviewing techniques that are described. And these are for, general interviewing. You can have open-ended questions or closed-ended questions. Most people prefer open-ended questions because they give people an opportunity to talk about what they're doing, and you can assess their level of competence and also their level of interest in what they're doing. A couple of questions. What is the corrective action if the product does not reach the targeted temperature? In other words, you're asking that line person, what do they do if the temperature is not correct? And then you expect for them to give you a description of what the procedure should be. Another one this might be a question for a QA person. How do you verify the sanitation prior to the start of production? What are they doing? It's a little bit more open question than by just asking, do you swab after start or during startup? Or do you visually inspect? Because then you get a yes or no answer, and you don't give the person an opportunity to open up and talk about what they're doing. There are times when you have to use a closed-ended question, such as if you're in a situation in the food industry where you have a CCP or preventive control in your plan, your food safety plan. You've got to ask a question that is specific. One example could be anywhere. What should the minimum fill level be in bottling? You're making a bottled product. What's your minimum fill level to be acceptable? Then they would have to give you a very discrete answer. 500 milliliters, 10 ounces, whatever that number would be. So how you approach open-ended versus closed-ended questions also depends on your facility. If you have a lot of straight and cut targets, where you have to do something in 10 minutes or reach such temperature, or you have a discrete number or time period that you have to conform to, then maybe asking a closed-ended question might be appropriate. Okay, there's something called a GEMBA walk. I don't know how many of you have heard about the GEMBA system. You know, a lot of the quality systems, the quality management systems come from things that were done by you know, gurus in Japan who have developed these quality approaches. And there's something they call the GEMBA, which is a process where you look to develop leaders, better leaders. And you do that by having them exposed to various aspects of your operation. And you get better decision-making and better employees. Well, there are lots of things you can do on these GEMBA walks, but one of them is to walk around the facility to look for, in quotes there, detecting misalignment, abnormalities, problems, and waste. So in a sense, that's what you're doing in an internal audit. I mean, you're looking for what's right, but really, you really want to find out what's wrong so you can approach continuous improvement. So here are 7 questions that are recommended to interview employees during these GEMBA walks. So we'll go through them one by one. Ask the person, what are you doing now? And they can describe exactly how they go about their job. Is there a standard process for completing this task? They may or may not know if there's an SOP. Are you encountering problems while completing this task? And this gives you an index into the operation of the system. Are you encountering problems? What causes the problems? How do you find the root cause of the problem? How can you fix the problem? Who do you contact if you need help resolving the problem? Now, I have to say, in actuality, some of the line workers may answer yes to question 3, but then they go right down to question 7. If there's a problem, I call QA, or if there's a problem, I call my boss. But in some cases, many cases, you may find people can do these quick fixes, or they can fix the problem, and you get some kind of index into what's actually going on with that particular process and that particular operator. The GEMBA walk. Another poll, and I'm going to see if we have our poll capabilities again. Do you have an internal audit team? Yes, 3 people, 2 people, 1 person, or no assigned internal auditor. And I guess if you answer in the Q&A box, I'll be able to see that, but I don't have a capability to see any polling. I'm sorry. Here's a question to ask yourself. Chat room. Okay, somebody's got 2 people. Yes, to answer in the chat room. 3 people, and 1 person has no assigned internal auditor. So, okay, it varies, and I'm sure it's going to vary by the size of your firm, size of your facility. I've done some audits in facilities that have been 700,000 square feet. It takes the whole day to walk around the facility, let alone do an audit. So you need to have multiple people in those kinds of environments. We've got some more answers here. No assigned auditor. Let's see what else we got. 2 people, not sure. 1 to 2 people. Okay, that's good. Thank you for your answers. We're going to move along and talk now about your checklists, audit forms, and audit methods. Whether it's an iPad checklist, computer checklist, manual checklist, what types of forms? Before you set up a form, you have to know what it is you're going to be measuring. Once again, down to your scope statement. What is the scope of this undertaking? What am I going to measure? How am I going to measure it? Am I going to take a thermometer along with me on my audit and check temperatures myself? Or am I going to take portable pH meter or other kind of device, or a Am I going to use any kind of a hardness detector if I'm doing something that's capsulated or powdered? Am I going to use some kind of a viscosity meter if I'm looking at a liquid? How am I going to measure? Am I going to use a tool? Am I going to do visual observation? Am I going to look at records? So what am I going to measure? How am I going to measure it? How often am I going to measure it? Am I going to audit for 2 days and I'm going to measure it twice each day? Am I going to measure it once? This is in my audit checklist as I'm developing my audit checklist. Who is going to be doing this? Is the lead auditor going to be doing this, or is it going to be one of the team auditors? So who's doing that task? And then once it's done, if corrective action is needed, who is going to look at that corrective action? Once again, if you call something out, it's expected there will be some type of correction or corrective action. So if it comes to that, who is going to be responsible for reviewing it? And I will say this, although we'll talk about it later too, usually it's the lead auditor who is charged with the responsibility of evaluating all the non-conformances and evaluating the corrective action. But you can do it any way you want. If you want to have one of the team auditors do it, that's fine too, as long as that's set up in advance and you know what the expectations are. Again, objective criteria, easily measured. You know, your pH has to be 3.5 to 3.8 for a juice, for example, for an acid food, or your protein content must be. Those are things that you can easily measure. Some things can be binary. Either they have to have gloves or they don't have to have gloves. Either they have to have a beard guard or they don't have to have a beard guard. Those are things that can be measured. Those are clear expectations. Some aspects you may do in your internal audit, though, are not objective. They could be opinions, in a sense. Dirty equipment. You write up in your non-conformance log, you know, the packaging filler head was dirty. Let's just say that. Who decides what dirty is? That's a subjective evaluation. My definition of dirty is very different than my 12-year-old grandson's definition of dirty. And if you have kids and grandkids, you may recognize that. So if you're going to call out something subjective, such as dirty equipment, take a picture, demonstrate why you said what you said. Because if you accuse somebody, let's say in packaging or any other, you accuse a facility of being dirty, that's a pretty serious accusation. So you want to make sure that you have grounds to support what you did. Take a picture. Now, external auditors can't take pictures, but internal auditors often can. Again, another one, poor lighting. How do you know that's poor lighting? Are you going to take a light meter out there and measure the foot candles? Take a picture and show what the situation is so that you can justify your evaluation when somebody asks about it. My very favorite corrective action or root cause or cause analysis is where somebody writes up operator oversight. If you've seen any audit checklists, you might see a response from the manager saying operator oversight. I don't know what that means. Did the operator oversee that error? Order that error? No, the correct phrasing is operator error. You know, operator oversight doesn't tell you anything about the actual non-conformance. So your objective evidence should be observed, measured, verified, documented. Whatever you're going to call out, if you call out a non-conformance, needs to be documented, and that could be a picture, or that could be listing of the the document or listing of the operation. That last bullet point on the screen is really kind of an aside for people that are regulated by FDA, because especially in the preventive controls for human food, the PCQI, or the preventive controls for qualified individual, has to evaluate records. That's kind of an internal audit. And FDA has stated that they want to see actual values in the records and not things like pass, fail, yes, no, X, no. Those kinds of things are discouraged. So, for example, if you're checking a metal detector, if you have somebody that's assigned to that position, and they're checking it, let's say, every hour. On a number of production records and batch records, I've seen where they're checking the metal detector and then they're making the checks, or they're putting Y or N, yes or no, pass or fail. Better to put in 2 millimeter, 4 millimeter, 3, whatever tool you used to make it pass. Or if you're checking, my example I've used before is the fill level. If you want to check the fill level of a liquid, you want to record the fill level actual amount, 12 ounces, 10 ounces, 40 milliliters, rather than just pass, fail, or yes, no on your quality checks. I hope that makes sense. FDA wants to see an actual value rather than a binary answer, yes or no. You want to demonstrate through your evidence when you're doing the audit what it is that's being called out. Is it a company policy issue or procedure? If it is, you want to refer to the document. You want to refer to the policy. If you're evaluating, let's say, a cleaning procedure, and the instructions say, you mix 2 ounces of this with 1 gallon of water, you want to refer to the SOP that describes that. Company procedure. Legislation, if something is violative of legislation, for example, if you miss a CCP in a HACCP plan or in a food safety plan, that's a regulatory requirement. You want to specify that you're calling this out because it's required by 21 CFR 1, well, I guess it would be 117 in the case of food, that it's being called out for that reason. If it's an SQF requirement or a BRC requirement, such as environmental monitoring, you want to say this violates or this does not conform to SOP or clause number of the SQF manual or of the BRC standard. Or customer requirements. If the customer wants to see a SKU number on every case label, that's in the contract. So you're calling it out because it's not what the customer wants. So it has to be specific. Common terminology is important. What is a minor nonconformance? What is a major nonconformance? Who defines that? And what constitutes adequate corrective action? These definitions on this slide are more or less guidelines. Depending on what you're auditing, how you're auditing, you may decide how that goes. Typically, if it's a safety issue, you have to be pretty rigid. But if it's a quality issue, you have a lot of bandwidth as to what you call a minor, what you call a major, and what you call a critical. Critical really means critical. As you can see there at the top, it's a quality, safety, or legal issue. And in a critical nonconformance, typically they'll stop the operation or they'll do something serious to curtail operations. So criticals are rare. A major is when your system is not working or you do have a doubt that the product is not meeting specifications. Let's go through that a little bit more. Let's say that I'm doing a document audit and I look at a production record and I look at a sanitation record and I see that an allergen product was run, but I didn't see there was any verification of allergen removal. I don't know for sure that the next product coming down the line is going to be allergen containing or allergen free. I don't know if there's been any crossover contamination from the allergens, but that wasn't done, and that puts me in doubt. So that's going to be a major, in my view. Again, that's a safety issue. Could be a serious safety issue. I don't have any proof that there's allergen in the next product, but I don't have any proof that there's not. That next product was at risk. So I would look at that product as a major non-conformance. And then if there's a substantial failure to meet any requirement of the facility standards. I used to see this a lot with beard guards. For some reason, people don't want to wear those beard guards, where I would see in the policy that people in production would have to wear a beard guard, and I'd go into production room 1, production room 3, packaging room 3, and I'd see people not wearing beard guards. That tells me that your system is not working. So I call that a major, even though there's no direct evidence that there was any contamination of the product from the person's facial hair. But it's a policy issue as well as a potential safety issue. Not much of a safety issue. Nobody ever got sick on hair, but it's a failure to meet your standards that you set up. So I would call that a major. Again, your mileage may vary. You may look at this list and you maybe decide you don't agree with me. You think it should be minor. If guys aren't wearing the beard guards. But, again, that's a decision you would make as an auditor, lead auditor. And then, of course, a minor is something that is just a one-off. Like, for example, with my example on the beard guards. If I see one person without a beard guard and 7 other people there do have beard guards, I call that a one-off, and that would definitely be a minor, especially if they're not in a place where there would be any risk to the product. Other things that can constitute a minor are recurring situations. Let's say that I pass this door to production room 2 every day, and I see that door doesn't close tightly. And I've been walking by that door for a month, and I have seen that that door doesn't close properly. And now I'm doing my internal audit, so I would write that up. It's a small thing, but it's been recurring. So again, these are just some examples. As I said, you have to look at what your situation is, what your product is, what your requirements are, and decide whether any non-conformance that you decide to call out would be major, minor, or critical. That's a decision. And this decision, as I said, is often left to the lead auditor to make. Here's some examples of gathering evidence. The company requires that all workers in the blending room wear gloves. What's the best way to write that up? Well, you could say there were 8 workers in the blending room and one was not wearing gloves. You could say there were 8 workers in the blending room and Linda wasn't wearing gloves, if you wanted to get back at Linda for something, right? Certainly don't want to call anybody out by name. No personal attacks or no personal observations. Probably the best way to write that would be There were 8 workers in the blending room, and the operator of blender number 3 was not wearing gloves. So that gives you some insight into where it was and who it was without getting personal. Hope that makes sense. Here's another one. This would be for a supplier approval program. RSOP 9.1 requires that QA and review and approve each supplier every 2 years in a supplier approval program. One way to say that is records show that the supplier bogus trading company was last reviewed in July 2019. And another way to write that is that records show that the supplier was not reviewed on time. Writing it the first way, being more precise, gives you more information, and I think helps the management to look deeper into what happened in 2019, what happened that it wasn't reviewed. Just to say that it wasn't reviewed on time doesn't give much fodder for a corrective action. And then here's a third one. SQF 11233 requires calibration be performed according to regulatory requirements and/or to the equipment manufacturer's recommended schedule. You could say, records show that the refrigerator thermometer was not calibrated. Well, if you only have one refrigerator, that may suffice, but it's better to be more specific. The infrared thermometer with this serial number in refrigerator 1 is recommended to be calibrated every year. The calibration was last recorded in February of 2021. I will say a little bit now about calibration records, because as an auditor, that's one of the things I always look at. And one of the most frequent findings I will see is that the scale or the thermometer or the pH meter or whatever it is has been calibrated, but they forget to put on the sticker. So look at the sticker, and then if you don't see a sticker, look for the calibration record itself. Sometimes, and as I said, not infrequently, you'll find that a vendor came in, did the calibrations, and then forgot to sticker the products. Just as an aside there in terms of what you're doing when you're auditing calibration. Another example, customer X requires that its SKU number be printed on case labels for product A. Printed case labels for product A, lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 did not contain the SKU. That's a very concise statement. It doesn't say who did it, why it was done, only that the case labels do not contain the SKU. You don't want to write up that operator forgot to print. You don't want to associate a cause. You just want to say what's so. On this example, you don't want to say the QA forgot to calibrate. You just want to say the calibration wasn't done. And then QA can figure out, or the group responsible for it, why it wasn't done. How do you characterize your evidence? You can state things in the positive, the negative, or other ways. The positive. The door in production room 2 was opened and should have been shut during the audit. Well, the negative way to express that, the door in production room 2 was not closed properly. So, you can say it any way you want, positive or negatively, as long as it's communicated in an objective fashion. Chronic or continuous. During the last 2 audits, auditors found that the door in production room 2 did not close properly. Continuous. Isolated occurrence, again, if it's a one-time occurrence, or system-wide. Auditor observed that production room doors 3, 4, and 7 did not close properly. So you can make these phrased any way you'd like. If you do have a system-wide observation, it's best to place that under one non-conformance. You don't want to do one for door number 2, door number 3, and door number 7. You want to say these production doors were not closed properly. That makes sense. Okay. We have a few more slides and then we're going to go to a break. If there is a systemic issue, this would be one way to write it up. 8 workers in the blending room, 3 not wearing gloves. Operator of blender 3, QA tech at blender 2, and bagger at blender 1. So that would suggest that a system-wide training would be necessary. Another possibly major non-conformance. Supply records are supposed to be approved every 2 years. There were 3 suppliers that were last reviewed in 2019. So what happened between 2019 and 2022? That's a system-wide. Your system wasn't working if you find 3 suppliers that were not approved. And then finally, the example with case labels. Printed case labels for product A did not contain the SKU in lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But we also had a customer complaint in January that the SKU were missing from those cases. So there you have another trigger that this is a systemic problem that could be a major. Talked about this earlier. We'll just mention this briefly now. How do you classify non-conformances and who is responsible for doing it? What is the significance to the business? How serious is it? How frequent does it happen? And what risk is there, if any, to the product or the process, and who makes that judgment call? Again, whoever is involved in setting up these internal audits needs to decide who's going to make the call. Major, minor, critical. Okay, so I'll do another poll here and we'll then take a quick break. What would you do about this? Printed case labels for product A, lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, did not contain the SKU. In January, customer X complained that the SKUs were missing from case labels on 2 lots. Would you call that a major, minor, or critical? And I'm going to go in to see if I have any Q&A here. And go ahead and answer, and I'll see if I can find. Oh. There we go. Well, these are questions. Somebody's going to call that one a major. See if there's anything in the chat room. Somebody else wants to call that a major. Major, major. People are going to call that a major. And I would tend to agree, in a customer audit, that could be a major, because you already have a customer complaint. So you know that you might be on shaky ground on some aspect of your orders. And now you have the same thing happening again. So again, in a quality audit, that would be a major. If you're just doing a safety audit, it would be something to write up separately, but it doesn't injure product safety, does it? No, probably not. So let's look at the next one. Company requires all workers in the blending room wear gloves. 8 workers in the blending room and only 3 were wearing gloves. Major, minor, or critical? What do you think? Major, minor, or critical? Okay, let's see if we have any answers there. Minor. Okay, somebody says minor, minor, major, major, major. Okay, minors and majors. And again, that may be a systems error, but it may not have any impact on the product, safety, or quality. You might want to call that a minor. If it's a policy violation and it impacts safety, you may want to call it a major. I have a tendency to call it a major anyway, but again, everything is dependent on your own operation. You know, wearing gloves in an OTC drug manufacturing facility is a little bit different than wearing gloves when you're handling open product, like out of a blender. So you might call that a minor. Again, whatever decisions you make, be prepared to justify, especially if you do call a major and somebody wants to know why that is a major. And our last polling question before our break. Here we have the uncalibrated thermometer. Is that a major, minor, or critical nonconformance? Major, minor, or critical nonconformance? Infrared thermometer, not calibrated. See what we have here. Chat room. Critical food safety. Okay, critical food safety. I think, is that for the thermometer? Or maybe it's, yeah, it's hard to see. We don't have a good visibility to which question's being answered, but critical and see what else we have. Major, major. You know, this is another thing that depends on your operation. Everything should be calibrated. SQF requires it to be calibrated. Where is that thermometer? If that thermometer is in a room where you have to keep your products cool for safety reasons, such as, you know, below 41 degrees, that could be a major if your thermometer is not calibrated. If that thermometer is in a warehouse where you're recording ambient temperature, maybe it's a minor. Again, it all depends on the severity to your operation and to your product. So think about how you're going to characterize different aspects as major, minor, or critical. In a food operation, probably if you're looking at the temperature of dairy or some other perishable product, I'd say major. But if you're looking at a warehouse, if you're looking at some ambient area, maybe it's a minor, because that ambient temperature doesn't have a lot of bearing on safety or quality. Again, just some things for you to think about as you go about your internal audit. And now we are going to take a break. Let me look at the time here. I'm on the East Coast, and in my world, it's 1:19 in the afternoon. 1:19 in the afternoon. So let's take a break. How about 10 minutes or so? Let's come back at 1:30. So while we're in the break, I'm going to look to see if there are any questions and see if I can answer the questions. And we'll come back at 1:30. Okay, everybody? See you then. 10-minute break. consistency. Okay, we're back from break. And in that period, we got a question that I wanted to answer from Vanessa out there. She asked, if the thermometer is not calibrated, would that be a critical in a food safety operation? It might be a critical. It depends on whether they were using it. If they were using it as a CCP, if the thermometer is not calibrated, do you have another method to verify that your CCP was met? And that would be no. And so that might be a critical. But again, it all depends on the operation. If you have other verification that your CCP was met, whether it's a temperature and time or other kinds of measurements that go along with that CCP, then it might be, in any case, at least a major, if it's a critical control point and the thermometer is not calibrated. Another part to that answer is, let's say your CCP is 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you check the CCP, you want to see the thermometer to read 170. or 175. So in that case, you might not call it a critical because you'd have to find out how much out of calibration that thermometer is. And you might do that by measuring it against measuring a calibrated thermometer, measuring the same thing, if that makes sense. But it would be at least a major and possibly a critical, in my view, depending upon how your system is organized and how you check your CCPs. I hope that answers your question. At least a major, could be a critical. Okay, so now we're going to move into the second part of our presentation this afternoon. And we're going to talk about checklists and questions and observations as you're actually preparing the audit and conducting the audit. Up to this point, we looked at, whether it's major, minor, or critical, how to put your scope together for your audit to understand specifically what you're doing for that particular internal audit, things to consider when you're trying to pick people who are going to be part of the internal audit team, and questions to answer. And we'll look again at those GEMBA questions that we talked about earlier also. Questions to ask and be answered during your internal audit. Now we're going to look at the flowcharts, the forms, questionnaires, and how to use your audit tools. Mostly people use checklists, whether that is in an iPad or computer format, or if it's on a piece of paper with a clipboard. It's usually a checklist. And most checklists will contain questions and possible answers, or questions and forms or data fields for you to put in your answer. Information to be collected, place for recording results and observation, a question or a statement format. So typically what you'll see in systems is you'll see, let's say on the left-hand column, you'll have your question or your statement. The statement could be, thermometers have to be calibrated at least once a year. The question would be, are the thermometers calibrated at least once a year? However you phrase that is totally up to you. It requires the same thing. That's in the leftmost column. And then typically in the next column, there will be a space where you can answer yes or no. Is compliant or is not compliant. If it's not compliant, there should be a column over to the right where you can describe the non-compliance. After you answer, there are other answers, by the way. You might answer non-applicable. If the question is the case label including a SKU number? This customer that you're auditing for right now doesn't require a SKU number. So in that case, you could have a non-applicable answer. That makes sense. So you could have a yes, it complies. No, it doesn't comply. N, A, non-applicable. And then you could also consider having a fourth response there, and that would be P. P for partial, partially compliant. If you have a requirement, let's say, that customer X wants to see both the case label and the expiration date, the SKU number on the case label and the expiration date, and you only have one, you only have the expiration date but not the SKU, you could say that's partially compliant. It's still a non-conformance, but it is partial compliance. And anytime you have an item to evaluate, you really do need to have a nice comments field so you can describe what you're seeing that's non-conforming. Concise, clear, and legible. Date the audit, number the pages. And again, leave a broad space for comments to be made. The form should be what we call auditor friendly. That is to say, it should follow the flow of the walkthrough. an auditor is going to walk through a facility. You don't want to put a question about receiving next to a question about packaging. You want to group all the receiving questions together, all of the preparation or pharmacy questions together, then all of the production questions, et cetera, so that in a walkthrough, it allows for the ease of the auditor's movements. Provide necessary references for the audit. If you're auditing against an SOP or standard operating procedure, have the number of the procedure in your form and have a copy of the procedure available to the auditor so that they can see precisely what is required and precisely where it may comply or not comply. Make sure all parts of the audits are completed before you submit it. Some organizations have some very clever people who can do Excel spreadsheets where you can't save it or submit it until everything is filled in. But in any case, there should be some kind of review to make sure that everything on the checklist is covered. And then you have to look at what you're going to have for a final audit report. What are you going to hand in or hand over? Some kind of record of what you did, but what is that going to look like? These are some things to think about. First of all, it should be reader friendly. People who didn't participate in the audit should be able to read what you wrote and understand what happened. And associate the questions to the answers. Again, such and such was called out because it violated such and such SOP. Associate the answers to the requirements. Designing an audit report. How is your audit report going to look like? Are you going to have an executive summary or an overview? If you're in an organization where the senior management's only going to read an executive summary, they're not going to go down into the detail, then you might want to have just a 2-3 line top level description of the outcome. How long is your report going to be? Is it going to have pictures, graphs, or are you going to look at month over month, year over year analysis? Pictures, graphs, text. Important question, who signs the report? Who takes accountability for that audit? Do you want to have the lead auditor sign it as well as the department manager? Only the lead auditor sign it, only the manager sign it. Again, some of those decisions that you have to drive through as you're preparing the report. None of these are cut in concrete. The only organization that is specifically named, or the only protocol that is specifically naming who has to be involved in the audit is, if you remember, that requirement for dietary supplements, where according to ANSI 455, QA or QC rather has to be involved in an internal audit. But other than that, who's going to be responsible for driving the report, or for compiling the report? Who's going to be responsible for signing the report? Who is the report audience? Who does that report go to? Does it go to senior management? Is it supposed to go to corporate management? Does it go just to the department, to quality managers? Who is the audience for that report? And probably a very critical question is, are you going to score your report? Are you going to have points that are deducted for various non-conformances? That can be tricky. Again, this is the decision. None of this is etched in concrete. You decide how you're going to handle that. If you're going to do an audit for SQF or ISO or another certification, usually there's a score. Sometimes there's a grade. They'll give you a G or an E, but usually there's some sort of score underneath that. So are you going to do that for your internal audits as well or not? And if you do score, how are you going to score? How many points are you going to deduct for a minor, for a major, for a critical? Again, there are organizations that like to establish scoring because it gives them perspective on month to month or year to year or department to department variability. You know, if they get a score of 85 in packaging and a score of 92 in maintenance, et cetera, they can compare. Or if they get a score of 85 in 2021, a score of 92 in 2022, et cetera, et cetera. So some companies like to do that because it gives an indication of continuous improvement or not. Some companies will just count non-conformances without scoring and say, you know, in 2021, you received 3 majors and 2 minors. In 2022, you received 1 major and 4 minors. You know, using that as a scale for continuous improvement. But there's no requirement for scoring. So again, these are all business decisions you'll want to make based on what your company needs and what you feel is going to produce the best outcomes. I did talk about the report audience, correct? Does that go to senior management or does it stay locally? Does that go to the corporate or does it stay locally? If you have a corporate entity that you have to report to, they probably have some kind of document that they will need to, that they have a format for you to fill in internal audit. So if you have a corporate governance or a corporate entity, we definitely want to check with them to see what they expect to see. As you are doing the checklist, as you are working through the audit, you may need to decide what documents and records you want to see. For example, if you're doing an audit of the packaging line, you might want to see fill level checks. You may want to see cap seal integrity. You may want to see date coding or label posting. So, you know, as you're preparing your team auditors and as you're doing this audit, you want to identify the records you need to see in order to make your evaluations. In a lab audit, for example, you might want to take a look at at some of the results. You might want to look at the proficiency testing results. You might want to look at the methods and evaluate, which methods they're using. Are they going to be compendial methods, from AOAC, or they're going to be FDA methods? QA/QC, you might want to look at how they measure quality. What do they look at? Color, taste, texture. So you may want to present to your auditee a list of things that you're going to want to see. And then reference materials. Again, I mentioned that earlier. You should have a reference for what you're auditing against. If it's an SOP, if it's a regulation, if it's an ISO requirement, whatever it is you're auditing against. And then the prior audit results. Was there anything in the prior audit that might be a repeat offense or could affect what you're doing on this audit? So again, as you're working through the audit, these are some of the things that you will need to have ready. You can do what's called forward tracing or backward tracing if you're looking at product records and product performance. Forward tracing is when you, for example, will take a finished product and trace where it is. This is the kind of thing you would do in the event of a recall. If you had to recall a product, you would find the product code, the lot code, and trace to where it was shipped. So that may be part of the records you want to see. Or you might do backward tracing. You might want to find an item in the warehouse, finished product, and ask the auditee to do a trace of every ingredient in that product, where it came from, and how much of each ingredient is left in inventory, backward tracing, forward tracing. Those are commonly done by certification auditors, but it's a good idea if you want to do that as well. But if you do, you have to give people time. You know, if you're going to do a backward trace, you want to give them a time period in which to do that backward trace. So as you prepare your audit opening meeting, you want to give that information as best as you can. You can interview people. We talked about those questions you can ask. Are you looking at a range of customers or a single customer? Again, that depends on your audit. You know, we're only going to look at products for customer Z, or we're going to look at products for customer Z and customer Q. Or you could use a date. We're going to look at all records from February 25th, or all records from February 25th through February 28th. So, you know, again, those are methods that you decide upon as you're preparing to do the audit. Are you going to just do observations and see how people are doing? I don't know, is there good hygiene? Is there good operation of the line? Are you physically going to take measurements or samples? And are you going to review records? Those of you who are in a SQF or BRC or FSSC environment for food products, you know about this creature called the unannounced audit. That's when the certification body will give you a date range, or you can give them a date range, in which an audit will occur. They're not specific about when the auditor is going to show up. You could do that on an internal audit. You could say this will be an unannounced audit. You could have an announced audit, which is usually what happens in an internal audit. In any case, someone, preferably senior management, has to communicate to the staff that's being audited that an audit will take place, an internal audit will take place, with the details, why the internal auditor is going to be held, what it's going to cover, who is the point of contact, which would be maybe the lead auditor, who would be the point of contact. And then at that point, you can describe the documents that you might need. For example, if you're going to do a forward trace, you're going to say, well, I'll need documents from February 25th to 28th for product X, Y, and Z. And again, it's important when you send an email or send a notification about this audit to the staff that you emphasize that you're not the police. You're auditing a system. You're auditing a process. You're making sure that the procedures work the way they are intended to work. You're not policing people. One form it could take would be an email or a memo to the affected staff, who the lead auditor is, the audit dates, which shift you're going to audit. You know, most auditors prefer to do first shift and not be there from 3 to 11 at night for second shift, but pick your shift, what your scope is going to be, who you're going to want to talk to in terms of what positions, what documents you're going to want to see, and a confirmation that they received your message. Just to prepare people of this occurrence of an internal audit. So when you're actually on site for the audit, you want to first establish an opening meeting. Just don't show up and start auditing. Have an opening meeting. Establish the logistics. You know, how much square footage are we covering? How many lines are involved here? What products are being run? What products are being packaged? You know, so you know what to expect when you're on the floor looking at operations. Or the logistics. If you're doing a document review, where am I going to sit? Where are you going to bring the documents? You know, How much time will it take for you to bring me these documents? So the logistics of how you're going to go through with the audit. Do I need protective clothing or footwear? That might be a simple question, but sometimes people aren't aware of what other departments require. For example, if you're going to go in and do a lab audit, you're going to need a pair of goggles in most cases. And if you're a lab person and you're going to go in and audit quality QA, you're going to need a hairnet, most likely. So, find out what physical equipment, what PPE you might need. Find out lunch and break times, because it's important to respect the operation. If you happen to show up to audit a packaging line and they're on break, you don't want to bring them back from break. You need to wait for them to come back, and then you'll, as respecting the staff, you'll do the rest of your audit. Then, of course, do I need any monitoring equipment, refractometer, pH meter? Do I need to do anything with a hardness tester or a viscosity tester? So what equipment is in use, and should I have any of that equipment at my disposal? You want to be as close as possible to tell the people you're auditing how long you're going to be there, because they do have a day job and they need to make their production orders fulfilled. So give them some idea of how long you're going to be there and approximately when you're going to have a closing meeting. Typically, the closing meeting is going to be with the supervisor or manager only, but sometimes other people show up. So you want to make sure that they have adequate notice that they're going to be needed for this closing meeting. You can't be precise in most cases as to exact time, but you can say things like, well, we're doing a closing on Thursday afternoon. And give them some wiggle room so that they can be there if needed. Even if you're not doing a facility audit, it's suggested that you do some observations of the facility. If you see a broken door, a broken window, something, you might not have it on your audit checklist because you're auditing, let's say, the packaging line. But if you do see facility improvements that are needed, it's a good idea to make note of them and to communicate them, although they may not necessarily have to be on your audit checklist. If you see a ceiling tile missing, for example, or a crack in the floor that people are tripping on, or any kind of OSHA thing, a forklift that's moving too fast along the floor, and the speed at which the forklift is moving is dangerous to facility walking around, staff walking around the facility. I've seen that quite a bit too. Observe procedures and behaviors. Walk through the facility. Again, respect breaks and lunches. Look at who's touching product, no matter what you're doing, who's touching product, hand and glove use, and do they have the right PPE for GMP? When you're auditing, reviewing documents, you want to look for completeness. Are there missing items on the production record or on the batch record? On the receiving record? Is everything accurate? If you're doing a calculation of production yield, do the numbers match up? Everything is done in a timely manner, legible, and if there's a deviation in corrective action written into the record, you might want to explore that. For example, during a number of audits that I've been involved with, you'll see in the production record or batch record, you'll see that there is a break, and somebody might write on the record, equipment breakdown, 4:15 p.m. Then later on, you'll see production resumes, 6:08 p.m. So what you might want to do is find out what happened with that equipment and see if that's an indication of anything that you need to observe in your audit. Hope that makes sense. But if you're doing a paperwork audit, you want to look for deviations and what corrections might have been done. Again, your audit is focused on gathering the facts, just the facts. Don't focus on assigning blame or assigning cause. What do I mean there? You are looking, let's go back to the packaging line. You're looking at the packaging line and you're seeing that the operator has to check the fill level of the liquid every 30 minutes. And you see that the 405 and the 535 checks are missing. So you go to that operator or you go to the supervisor and you say, I found these items are missing. And the operator or the supervisor says, oh, I forgot. Or, oh, I was over there talking to the manager and it didn't get happen. You don't care about that. You don't put, it's their responsibility to tell you why it happened. You just put down what was. The checks for 405 and the checks for 535 were missing. That's in your audit report. Later on, when they do corrective action, they can go into why that occurred. Assigning blame, again, as I said with the Linda example earlier, you don't want to say, well, Josh forgot to put this. You don't want to do that. Just say, these records were missing. These entries were missing. And then who did it, when it was done, why it was wrong, why it was done. That's up to the department to decide. So don't accept their initial explanation. Let them explain later on in writing. Hope that makes sense. Also, do not give solutions. You know, if you see that there's something happening, that you've got let's say you've got a leak in a line or something, and you could say, well, you could fix it by doing X, Y, Z. No, don't do that during the audit. If you want to do that after the audit, your job is not to give solutions. Your job is to record objective evidence. And these are the jumbo walk questions again. What are you doing now? Is there a way to complete this task? Are you encountering problems while completing this task? And if so, how do you know the cause? How do you fix the problem? And who do you contact if you need any help to resolve a problem? Again, all of what I'm saying here is really based on my personal experience and observation, along with the review of records and protocols and standards for the past 25 years. All of these things may not fit your situation, like the jumbo walk questions may or may not work in your operation. They're just out there for you to observe and evaluate. So in terms of employee behaviors, don't ask too many questions at once. Give people a chance to answer. And sometimes pausing helps people to think. So you may get, one sentence answer and then nothing, but then don't chime in right away. Wait for the person, if they want to add something else. If you don't understand what they're saying, ask. Sometimes we will run into that when we're looking at non-English speakers, where they may say something doesn't quite make sense. You may need a second language translator to help you interpret what they say. Ask for clarification from somebody else if you need that. Okay, this is one of my favorite slides because this describes some of the people I've run into over the years who have gotten in the way of the audit, I'll say. There's a person called the distractor. You're doing your audit and they try to get you off track. Example, you're auditing the receiving area, for example, the receiving area, and your auditee says to you, hey, I heard you got a new car. It's out there in the parking lot. and then you prompts you to talk about your new car. Who doesn't want to talk about their new car? It's easy to get distracted by the distractors. So before you know it, you're deep into a conversation, and then you can't move forward with the audit. There is a person called the Interrogator, and that's a person, I say, gets you to lose time. They can't stop asking questions. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? What are your opinions on this? Did you see that? Did you see this? That's a person that's going to, get you to lose time. They're going to ask maybe good questions, but your focus is on the audit. Excuse me. There's a person I call the complainer. That's somebody who will tell you, excuse me, I can't stop coughing for a second. That's a person who will tell you, I've been trying to replace that blender for 5 years now, and they won't listen to me, and management doesn't listen. You've got people like that you may encounter in your audit. And then you may have the know-it-all. The know-it-all is one who says, I've audited before, and I used to do this, and I used to do that, and you're better if you do this, you're better if you do that. I'm sure you've run into at least one know-it-all in your lifetime. And then the fearful one is someone who's afraid of management, who's afraid of the audit. And these are ones where your interpersonal skills need to be at their maximum. Because you want to get the answer, but the person may be afraid of losing their job or getting disciplined, or may not want to talk to management at all. So that's a person that you have to really probe sometimes and be very delicate with in terms of getting the information that you want. Another area, I've been talking so long, I'm starting to cough here, I apologize. Make sure everybody's on the same page with regard to terminology, especially what defines major, minor, critical, what don't have one person say one thing and another person in the audit team say another thing. Make sure they're on the same page, and the auditors should support each other. If someone finds a non-conformance on your team and another auditor decides that's not a non-conformance, then you should take that discussion aside and not do it in front of the auditee. So you can come to some type of resolution without involving the auditee. Assure that a common approach is defined. If one auditor is taking pictures, all the other auditors should be taking pictures. Or if you want to have one person take the pictures on the team, you can tell the auditee, oh, Harry's going to take the pictures and we're going to write the notes. So that everybody understands what's going on in terms of images that are being taken. And also be respectful of people's privacy. Try not to take pictures of faces, but rather of objects and things on the line. You don't know where that picture is going to end up, and you want to respect people's privacy rights. Don't rely on memory. Always make notes. Write or photograph everything that supports your finding. Make sure you're specific on the documents. What document are you looking at? What's the document number or the name? What date was it? What version was it? Sometimes you have documents with multiple versions. And then in terms of deciding the severity, one of the big questions, is there a safety risk or a quality risk? If so, how? For this reason, it might be a good idea just to record the observations and then have the lead auditor or audit team discuss the observations and make a determination as to whether you're going to categorize it as a minor, major, or critical. If it's a safety issue, chances are it's going to be at least a major. If it's a quality issue or something that is non-quality, that's a customer requirement, then maybe, maybe not. It might be a major, it might not, depending on the circumstances. And again, who decides the severity? Typically, it's the lead auditor, but often you'll see that the audit team will discuss it and decide who is going to, or how it's going to be categorized. So the audit is completed. Now you have to tell the auditee that you're ready for a closing meeting, and you set the specific time. Review all of the notes, have your team discuss the checklist and iron out any differences that there might be. Look at the documents, look at the photos. Do the photos describe what you want them to describe? And then list all of the nonconformities you intend to raise. That last bullet point, complete the audit report. Sometimes the audit report is done well afterwards. You'll have a discussion and then do the audit report later after it's all closed out. When you're doing a closing meeting, you inform the auditee what you did, what areas were covered, and always try to find some positive thing to say about the operation. Thank you for your cooperation. Your folks were very cooperative. We found that your hygiene, uniform wearing, and your GMP was very good, and then go on to read out the nonconformances. Then you're going to announce when corrective action is needed, or a Kappa. Some people say corrective action, some people say Kappa, corrective and preventive action. You're going to agree on which items need corrective action and the time scale. How long are you going to give for the corrective action? You're going to give 30 days, 60 days, 15 days, depending upon the nature of the nonconformance and the risk. You could have a variable timetable. If you're doing a certification audit, as for SQF or BRC, typically you're going to get the 30-day period, but you can decide what period you want to include. And then thank everybody for their cooperation. So the audit's done, the closing meeting is done, your team has been dismissed. And now, after the audit, what do you look for? Well, you called out some items and that corrective action has to be done. Well, who's going to do the corrective action? And when is it going to be done? Once it's done, follow up. I think one of the more frequent nonconformances I've had to write is that corrective action has been done in an internal audit, but no one ever followed up to close out the corrective action for the nonconformance. They don't go back to the paperwork, review the paperwork, and say this has been completed and is effective. So look at the deadline that you've set and give yourself the information you need to follow up on that deadline to verify that the corrective action has been taken. And then again, look, if you do a year-over-year or month-over-month analysis as part of your audit, look at repeat nonconformances, progressive decline, or progressive upgrade. If a department, had a score of 82 in 2021 and has a score of 95 in 2022, that's a good thing. Communicate that as you communicate further with the auditee. So the follow-up again, what I said just now is a follow-up with the auditee. Now here's a follow-up with the audit team and for the audit itself. Did we do what we said we were going to do? Did we achieve our goals? Did what we get out of this internal audit prove useful for continuous improvement of our system? And what about our questions and the areas we covered? Is there anything in the audit that needs to change? So in addition to following up with the person or department that was audited, you need to follow up with the team to see what changes, if any, need to be made. Verifying corrective and preventive action, how does that go? Are our procedures correct? Our SOP said X, but maybe we should be doing Y. We should change that SOP because it's not working. And then if you have ineffective corrective actions or repeats, how do you do that? Some of the certification audits have this protocol where you may have a minor observation in 1 year. If that same observation is present in the second year, it automatically escalates to a major. You might have seen that in certification audits that some of you may have been experiencing. Do you want to do something like that if the corrective action doesn't work? How are you going to address ineffective corrective actions? Something senior management might need to be involved with as well. Develop strategies to use when corrective actions don't work or they're not done. Again, senior management can be your partner there. Sometimes with a corrective action, you have a short-term fix and a long-term fix. If you have a machine that breaks down, well, we're going to fix the machine, but we know it's on its last leg, so we're going to have to buy a new machine. So you have the short term is correcting the old machine, the long term is buying the new machine. If you have a sink that needs to replace, short-term fix, we're going to not use that sink. We're going to use another one in a different room. Long-term fix, we're going to replumb and we're going to make a new sink. Those are some examples. You might have a short-term and a long-term fix. Root cause analysis. People give courses. I've done courses on root cause analysis. That's a whole different approach to a corrective action rather than just quick fix. You really want to look at what the real cause was. And again, I won't say much more about that now, but there's lots of documentation and lots of training on root cause analysis and different ways to do it. One other thing to look at is who approves the corrective action. You have got your corrective action lined up. The auditee submits the document that shows what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. Who's going to say that's okay? Is the auditor going to do that? Is senior management going to do that? Who is going to approve the action, the corrective action? More questions? Do you need to re-audit? If there's some problem that yields a major non-conformance, do you need to go back and re-audit that 30 days out, 60 days out, 90 days out to confirm that the corrective action works? And then, as I said earlier, identify and develop strategies to use when corrective actions are not effective. I guess that's a little repetitive there. So as we wind down, we've given you lots of information, again, based on protocols that have been with ISO, with SQF, with BRC, with other standards organizations, and my experience and others' experience as audits. But we're going to close with a couple of slides here. First of all, we're going to go back to what we said at the very beginning. Internal audits cover issues that are fundamentally important: survival and profitability of the business. They're going to let managers know how well your systems are working to keep the company on track, and how you can improve your systems and processes for the benefit of the company, staff, and management. Now, for those of you who are really serious about being auditors, the document that I mentioned early on in this presentation is one that I highly recommend. It is the ISO 19011 document, Guidelines for Auditing Management Systems. It talks about the general principles and approach to auditing, no matter if it's an internal audit, an external audit, a customer audit, and then how to manage audit programs and how to evaluate auditors, what to look for in auditors. So ISO 919011, the most recent version is 2018, Guidelines for Auditing Management Systems. So that's it. I thank you very much for your attention. And we have about 30 minutes left. So if you have questions, we can deal with them now. Let me look into the question window. Okay. I don't see any new questions. I'm not sure whether Amy is around to.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Do you see any questions? The ones I have, I found one at 12:23 and one at, oh, I can't
Hang
even.
on, let me turn up the volume real quick. Okay, let's see. I have,
Oh, here's a question.
okay.
I understand that we do not want to use names to not look like the blaming game, but how does the supervisor or lead address the issue if you don't specify which employee is not complying? Well, that's a good question from Vanessa. And yes, you do specify it, but you don't write it down. You know, to get something written is a little bit stronger than having something just being verbally communicated. So you can say the operator of blender number 3 was not wearing gloves, and the supervisor should know who that was and introduce a training opportunity for that person. If you are an auditor, it's your job to call it out. It's not your job to take the corrective action. Like in the blender situation, I would say that probably this is an opportunity for retraining that person who wasn't wearing gloves. But again, that's not part of your audit. That's part of the corrective action. I hope that makes sense. Okay, any more questions? How do you address non-conformances from other departments that do not apply to the current scope of the department you are auditing? That's another great question. You don't include it, in my view, you don't include it in the audit checklist. You do make notes of it as an aside, and you inform who needs to be informed. Like, for example, if you are auditing the facility and you notice that the back door is propped open by the maintenance staff, you're not auditing maintenance, but you know that having that back door open is a pest control issue and it's a security issue, right? So you want to make sure that it's known, but you don't have to include it in your audit. Another question. How to verify that Kappa was performed and effective in a post-audit follow-up? Well, again, you may have to re-audit. What you found to be inadequate, audit it again. Is it adequate? If it's a paperwork error where somebody did not fill in the right form or fill in the appropriate signature, whatever it is, then you would want to go back and look at subsequent documents for that individual and also look at the training records for that individual. But otherwise, you can re-audit the whole thing, you know, re-audit that particular area. Sometimes you may find that it may be something in SOP that is not good, and then by the auditee submitting their SOP or submitting the information, you may be able to close it out. I'm giving you the best answers that I can without knowing the actual circumstance on how you follow up on a Kappa. Do you have to have an opening meeting and a closing meeting? I believe yes. Again, there's no rule. None of the protocols for any of the certification audits require an opening and closing meeting. But I think it is important to communicate what is going to happen so that people aren't caught off guard, unless you want them to be caught off guard. But I think an opening and a closing meeting is important. And then once you're done with the audit, somebody needs to know what you found. So again, it's up to you. There's no requirement for any of this that you have. Well, for certification audit, your certification auditor and your FDA person have to have closing meetings with you. But there's nothing in SQF or BRC or ISO that says you have to have opening and closing meetings. I just think they're a good idea. They get everybody prepared, and when you're done, they tell you what temperature you took, what you found. Ineffective correction action. What else can you do after a re-audit? If you have recurring, then that's the time, I think, to get senior management involved. Now, if you do a non-conformance and it's not followed up on, if it's not effective, then you need to go to the next level because you're doing your job as internal auditor. So I think that's the time to go to company management, department management, whoever would be the next level, and discuss your situation, discuss why it's not happening, that the audits are not being closed out. Okay, I think that's all the questions. I answered that about opening and closing meetings, and once again, there's no requirement, but it's a good idea. Can an auditor be exposed to legal liability if they miss something important or critical? That depends on your company. In the past, external auditors have been held liable, sued, third-party auditors. Internal auditors, that depends on your company policy. I doubt that if you're an internal auditor working for a company, that they would want to target you if you made a mistake. I think that if you miss something important, there might be a reprimand or a consultation. But I don't know. Again, that's hard to figure out. It depends on your company. Can you suggest some checklists? I cannot. I've dealt with a lot of different checklists, and I don't subscribe to any commercial product in any way. So unfortunately, I cannot suggest a checklist to use. But I will say that there are lots of good checklists and lots of good software programs online, and that maybe that's something you might want to evaluate before you get involved in creating your internal audit. And we have one more question. Will we receive a recording of this training? Amy, are you still there? I think so.
I'm still here.
Yeah. The question is, will we receive the recording of this training?
No, EAS trainings are intended to be live and in person, so we don't provide the recordings after the fact.
Okay, you do have the slides. We did make the slides available.
Right.
And you have my email address. So if there's any particular question you have after you review what we talked about today, I'll be happy to answer that. And I want to put that out for everyone. If there's something that you think of that you wanted to ask, but you didn't ask it today, send your comments and your questions to, I guess, to Amy Scanlon at EAS, and she will forward them to me, and we'll make a list of those questions and we'll answer them as best we can.
And Susan, I have just a quick question from somebody who emailed me regarding one of the slides. Did you add additional material or just move slides around?
I may have added a word or two.
Okay, but largely it's the same as the, okay, great. That's what I thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, once again, thank everybody for attending. Thank everybody. Oh, will we be getting a certificate for this? Wallace has one question there. Amy, I believe that we're going to issue certificates?
Yes, I'll create a participation certificate and get those out in the next few days.
Okay. So, once again, thank you everyone for your participation and for your great questions that you asked. I hope this was a valuable experience for everyone, and I hope that EAS will see you again at one of the continuing series of webinars that are offered on all sorts of subjects. So thank you, and
yes, thank you all. And I like Michael just wrote good day and happy auditing. I think that's a great way to wrap it up.
yeah, happy auditing, everybody. Thank you again.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.